welcome to the second episode of the Women's History Month Speaker Series. My name is Jewo Jatta. I am joined by Claudia Fox-Tree. Claudia has spoken internationally about indigenous rights and history. She is a tribal member of the Lukeke Guania Taino tribe. For 22 years, she has sat on the board of Massachusetts Center for Native American Awareness. She has written extensively about embracing the history and culture of indigenous people. She is also an incredibly talented artist specializing in handcrafted clay beads designed for Native American jewelry and hair accessories. Claudia, thank you so much for taking the time to be here tonight.
Tagwe, Dituno, Kena Atiano. Dakadiri, Claudia Fox-Tree. Dakadiri, Arawak, Yorman. Kawaii Daka Iaha. Und auch Deutsch Mutterlichseits. So for those of you who understood part of that, let me say the rest of it, which is I'm learning the Taino Arawak language. But I said I was Arawak Yorman, which identifies my tribal nation that I grew up knowing by that name. It is an Americanized name. I don't know what the original name is. And Yorman for the island that I can most recently trace my ancestors to, which is the Arawak word for St. Vincent. And I point that out because I've grown up, that's where my ancestry is from, but I've grown up in Massachusetts. And I want to acknowledge that we are currently on the Massachusetts and Pawtucket land. That's also the land that I currently live on. And growing up in this area, my identity and my community was around the Native American people of this area. So I use that term very broadly. Plus we have to remember that this entire what we know as North and South America have the name of America. So saying indigenous and saying American is fraught and complicated in terms of what word we're going to use. And indigenous people exist all over the world. There are indigenous people in China, in Africa, in Australia, and when they come here, they're still indigenous to those places and they're guests on someone else's land. And so I see myself as a guest on this land of the Pawtucket and the Massachusetts people, and having grown up in community with Wampanoag, Nipmuc, and Micmac in particular, who have embraced me as part of the community. And like she said, I've been with the Massachusetts Center for Native American Awareness, and I have learned a lot by being in that community. I brought books that I'm going to talk about later because I didn't learn everything just in the community. But, you know, it's not like I could go to every weekend to some kind of a location that was the same place and learn about my history and culture like other people can. Like, I can't go to a synagogue or a church or a Hebrew school, or, you know, there's just a lot of things available. Not in my town, probably not in my county. You know, powwows were the way that I got educated, and those changed depending on where they were. And now they're really hard to come by because of the pandemic. So I just want to acknowledge that the work that I do for Native American people, while I've grown up in that community and have that identity, I am multiracial, and I said that I also spoke German. That was one of the things I said in my introduction, auch Mutterlichseits. That's actually my first language. My mother's German, and that was the first language I learned. I lived in Germany for a while before we moved back to the States, and I consider myself a fluent English speaker, and I want to acknowledge that as well, because speaking English is a huge advantage and a privilege in this society, because it allows me to read research, to quickly analyze documents. It gave me access to higher level education and degrees. I'm currently in a doctoral program at Lesley University. English allows me to speak on behalf of my students with special needs. I am a special needs teacher of over 35 years in a public middle school. It just gives me so many advantages, and part of the work of being anti-racist or being diversity educators or decolonizing work, you know, however you want to describe it, is understanding where we have easier access, where we have those privileges. And so language is one of them, and I want to make sure I acknowledge that. On the other hand, learning my traditional languages, it's hard enough to keep up the German, but learning a language that hasn't been spoken with regularity, like the Taino language, has been more challenging, but I know some songs, I know some prayers, some individual greetings and thank yous and those kinds of words, which I also look to learn if I'm traveling to other countries. And I said, I was happy to be here, and I greeted everyone with a welcome and said I was from the islands and that I spoke another language as well. So that was my little introduction. So I wanted to talk a little about what it means to actually learn your history, your culture, or the land you're on. And I'm going to start by saying that as a special education teacher in a middle school, I've had the opportunity to work with many teachers teaching other subjects, math, English, social studies, and science. And I also do teacher education through IDEAS, which is Initiatives for Developing Equity and Achievement for All Students, which is located in Bedford, Massachusetts, the Bedford-Burlington line right now. And so I've done teacher education, and one of the things about teacher education and working with educators in my own school is that in our history classes, we are actually not taught the history of this country. It is packaged as we're going to tell you the history of this country, but we're not actually taught the history of this country, because we're only taught the history of this country from like 1620 maybe, probably, and the 1700s. So we're missing about 40,000 years before that. And one of my challenges to folks who are teaching it from that frame of reference, that the history of this country started with white settlers, is that if we looked at other countries, I can almost guarantee that they don't start in the same way that the United States starts with their education of history. So if we were looking at China or Japan and they were teaching their country, their history of their culture, they probably wouldn't say, it all started in Mesopotamia, in the Fertile Crescent. I'm just pretty sure they would say it all started with the mountains and the rivers here in China, or the original people of Japan. And so in that same vein, we need to start with the original people of the land that we are currently on. So when we go back, 40, 30, 20,000 years ago, we have the indigenous people of, let's just focus on the United States or North America, because those boundaries are a little arbitrary, right? Some of the nations lived in what now is known as Canada, and some lived in what is now known as Mexico or South America, and they didn't have the same political boundaries as what they have now. But what the people did, the amazing architecture that was created, the domestication of animals, the domestication of foods, the technology used to create plants, and certain kinds of bioengineering for those plants, that all was happening here before the white Europeans first landed here. So we really need to start telling the story of this country with the story of this land and the people who are on this land. And that brings us way, way back. This book here, A People's History of the United States, I brought some books as my models, is a great starting point to get that missing piece of history. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz wrote this book. It is not that old, and it has the social justice conscious perspective as well. It's not just here's the history laid out like a historian, although she is a historian. It includes what it meant when things were not included in history, or what it meant when certain things happened in past history. And I brought a bunch of books to kind of give examples of what I'm going to be talking about. And because of Women's History Month, all of these books are female authors, except one of them, because it's a really good book. And all of these books are people who are indigenous, except for one of them, who is a male. So I have a male book. Oh, I said that. I said I have a white male book, and I have a white female book who is also not an Indigenous person, but I'll get to that of why it's important. So this is a great book for history. And then Roxanne worked with Dina Gilio Whitaker to write this book, Aren't They All Dead? And this is if you're not ready to get right into history as a starting point, another starting point is looking at what the stereotypes are. There's a lot of stereotypes, some you might be aware of right off the top of your head, like being savage, being noble. There's other ones, Columbus discovered America, those kinds of things that are just inaccurate. And this book breaks it down to 20 other myths, right? So there's 20 different things here, and you can read each chapter at a time, and they kind of stand alone. You could use it with students that are middle school or above to analyze one of the chapters about the stereotypes and the myths. So this is also a different starting point if you're going to be talking about Indigenous people. And for me, you know, I grew up with a father who, as my mother said, spent time with the Indians. That's how she sort of phrased it. She was a first generation, right? She moved here from Germany, and so she was an immigrant. She wasn't aware of all the holidays and events, and she knew my father disappeared a lot to be with the Indians. That was how she phrased it. And 30 years ago, more than that, when I was growing up in Massachusetts, there weren't a lot of Native events. There weren't a lot of powwows. And so there might have been something a few times a year, but not like it was before COVID and will be again, of like 3 things a weekend. So there's a lot more variety and choices nowadays than there was for me growing up. And when we went to those events, we often did political things. So like get a signature to remove the state flag. That's still in the State House. That's still, after 40 years, being fought, or other kinds of things like that, political awareness things. So it was through the community that I learned the cultural pieces, and my father was a art and art history teacher. And so within that history context, he had a lot of stories, and having relatives had told him about the islands. And so he had history, and I always knew Columbus didn't discover America from the day I could understand anything. And so for me, some of the stories, when I would read them in a book that came out, in fact, the first time I saw the word Arawak in print was in a white European author's book called A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. And Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz uses that same title, An Indigenous People's History of the United States. She had a conversation with Howard Zinn, and she said, you didn't really have a lot about Indigenous people. And he said, that's your book to write. So she did. But it was in the first chapter, because that makes sense, right? 1492, the Arawak, the Taino, that's the first group, the first Indigenous group. And so that's the first chapter. It was the first time I saw it in print, and it was around 1992. And I was out of college. So I went my entire K-12 never seeing the word Arawak or Taino in print. And that, you know, very different experience than my children had, or even this generation has. And so for me, reading in the book was validating. And then seeing Indigenous authors writing books as well, talking about that history, just added to information I already knew and validated it. So it's important to fill in that gap, but there's no perfect source. There's no perfect book. There's no perfect person. There's no perfect documentary. But I will say Exterminate All the Brutes, which is a 4-part miniseries on maybe HBO. I might be wrong, so apologies to the people that are producing it. And it is based on the book and Indigenous People's History of the United States. The author, the person who wrote it and directed it, also did I Am Not Your Negro, and his name is escaping me in this second, but that should be enough to get the right thing. And Raoul Peck, that's who it is, Raoul Peck. And he does a fantastic job bringing this book to life in a documentary style, and hitting important points, not only about Indigenous people, but how it is linked to the African American Black history story, and also to things like the Holocaust and the Jewish extermination story. So he does a lot of connecting that is really helpful as well. But there is no perfect source, and so getting a lot of sources, books, people is really important for a full picture of the story of Indigenous people. So we got history, we got stereotypes. Another important piece is the connection to the land, extremely important. When we don't talk about the land, we miss the whole story of this country, not only of the Indigenous people who are the land, but we miss the pieces of how this land has its own story, its own place. So for example, Indigenous people have creation stories and behavior stories, just like every other culture, which, by the way, we need to call their stories, their oral traditions, their sacred stories, just the way we would other cultures who have those kinds of origin stories. What I mean is they are not myths and legends. When we start calling the Bible, the Torah, the Bhagavad Gita, and all those books myths and legends, then maybe we can call Native stories myths and legends. But since we don't, we need to also talk about Indigenous stories as in the same kind of respectful way as oral traditions and sacred texts as we do about the other stories. And so the Native stories include animals, plants, things that have to do with the climate and the seasons from this continent. Indigenous people have origin stories that include things from the place of their origin. Everyone else has arrival stories, or immigration stories, or being taken and stolen stories. But only the Indigenous people have the origin stories of this actual place. And so that's important to keep in mind. That's the animals and plants, and these stories don't have elephants, for example. They have the animals from this area. And as we talk about the land, we need to remember that that land was taken. Now, sometimes people will say, well, it was a pristine wilderness absent of any Indigenous people. If you look at the history, Indigenous people were here all along. Yes, there was diseases. Yep. There was definitely murder and warfare and all of that happening, but there wasn't any huge collapse in population until the land started being taken. Because when the land was taken, the people were relocated from the land they knew. And so how they would get food, how they would honor their ancestors, how they would know how to build their homes, out of what materials, was lost or wasn't usable because they were moved to a new location with new land and materials and not the same things that they were used to. And so Indigenous people are smart, but that didn't, that there was definitely some loss of population as that move started happening, as well as when the land was taken and Indigenous people were moved, the food sources were often destroyed by the people who wanted the land. And so the entire buffalo herds out west, for example, being shot from trains that are crossing the continent, was a deliberate intent to destroy the food source of the Indigenous people, who then would die from starvation. So what I'm getting at is that it's really in the late 1700s and 1800s that the population is decreasing. And so we're not really talking about diseases at that point. We're talking about other means to reduce the population. And the land, the last pieces of land that were taken from Indigenous people were what we now call the national parks. So those national parks were beautiful and sacred to the Indigenous people as well, and so they were being protected and cared for right up until the end. And this book by Dina Julia Whitaker, who co-authored this one with Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, and Roxanne did this book, see all these connections? She writes a lot about that national park industry as well as other environmental actions. And so that's a great book, As Long as the Grass Grows. For those of you who have never heard that phrase before, it's language from treaties. Treaties often said, oh yes, this will be true as long as the grass grows and the rivers flow, which isn't what happened, but that's where this title comes from. And then Winona LaDuke has written many, many books. This is just 2 of her books. And she also writes about environmental destruction and sovereignty and reclaiming the land and what can you grow on the land, from wild rice to hemp. So she's written many books to learn more about the land. And as you read these books, you learn about the culture too. So you learn about what Indigenous people are doing for the culture. So now I'm going to move to my last two stacks of books. This is my very favorite book of all time, that if I were on a deserted island, I was to bring this book. I read it, I immediately read it again, and then I got an audiobook and I played it every time I work in my garden. It became a bestseller 5 years after it was released by word of mouth only. It's called Braiding Sweetgrass. It's by Robin Wall Kimmerer. This is her first book, which is great. It just doesn't have as many connections. This is about moss and Indigenous people, a lot of stories here. But this book is about history, contributions, environmentalism, and it's a great book if you want to up your science game, either your own science in terms of planting or your science you're teaching a class. So this is a great book for that. But my first introduction to contributions by Indigenous people is my white author male book. This is Jack Weatherford, and he wrote this book, Indian Givers. This is my yellowed old copy. He has an updated version that I also read. I get a lot of books out of the library and then return them, or I get them on audio, so this is just a sampling of my library. But he has a book that is more recent, that he's updated several things, but it is an amazing book about the foods and technologies that Indigenous people have contributed to the world, including, corn, beans, and squash, potatoes, and tomatoes. But it's so much more. For example, he'll talk about the potato and how it was propagated on the terrace farming in Peru, and also how it moved to Germany and it changed the mills because now they had potatoes, so they didn't need the mills, so the mills became the factories. It's really interesting in terms of what happens when you introduce some of the crops, for example, in what we now know as the Americas to other places in the world. So it's a great starting point for contributions. And then in my last pile, I have some novels. Now, I didn't bring Firekeeper's Daughter by Angeline Boulet, which is a great book too. I don't know why I missed that on my shelf. But I brought Louise Erdrich because she has a ton of books as well, kind of prolific writer like Winona LaDuke. And while Winona LaDuke is, you can count on environmentalism and the land, you never know what you're going to get from Louise Erdrich. Every book is a little bit different than the next one, and she's got a couple that are semi-autobiographical, but most of them are standalone, interesting stories. This happens to be a mystery. Her most recent, I think it's her more recent, unless she wrote another one since then, book, The Sentence, is a great story. It takes place in present day up till the pandemic in a bookstore, and it has ghosts and things in it. We are doing it as a book talk with the Mass Center for Native American Awareness in April, so that's a great book. Then there's this mystery here, The Marrow Thieves, another novel. This is science fiction. There's actually quite a bit of science fiction that includes Native Americans, but this one is about how it links to boarding schools in terms of they're being used as like hospitals because Native people's marrow is desired. So people don't have dreams anymore, and they found if they get the marrow from Native people, they can then dream again. And so the Native people are being hunted down and brought to these hospitals. Anyway, I don't want to say more, but it's a great book. And then I have my white author. So this is Erin McCormick. She's a Massachusetts author, resident, and she is a friend of mine and spent a lot of time on powwow, and she used her experiences at powwow and the people that she met, you might even recognize some if you're local, to write this great book that's written from 3 different perspectives of the history of boarding schools involved in this, what happens when you take children from communities, so the foster care system as it currently stands. It's got Indigenous characters and non-Indigenous characters. It's really well done novel. So there's novels, there's history books, contributions, all kinds of things that can inform the missing pieces that we haven't learned by growing up in this country and starting history in the 1700s. So I'm actually going to wrap up right now, and and I hope I've given you some ideas of places to go next, because I learned a lot by growing up in the community for sure, and I learned a lot or was validated by reading great books. So I'm an advocate and a teacher, so books are a good way to go. But I'm going to turn it over to you to see if you got some questions for me.
Yes, we do. For those who may not be familiar, what does it mean to be part of Native American First Nations people?
All right, what does it mean to be part? I think ask 100 Indigenous people, what does it mean to be part of a nation, and you'll get 100 different answers. You know, I think it isn't a one answer question. I will say for me, it means that there is a community that I can go to with questions specific to the nation that I belong to, that I've grown up with, that I know. And that community recognizes me as part of their membership, right? They recognize me as someone who is working to keep the culture alive. So, you know, identity is complicated, and part of, for Indigenous people who are, by this current census, about 3% of the United States population, it is more than what is your blood, your quantum, your heritage. It's also, are you passing on the culture? Are you keeping the culture alive? Because we want the next generation, or the next 7 generations, as it is often said in the Indigenous community, the Native American community, to know and benefit from those same things, the connection to the land, the language. Language says a lot about culture. And so we need to figure out ways to pass that on. And for me, being part of a tribal community of a nation is having that. But for other people, it could be something else. So it could be getting back land that was taken. So again, I'm a guest on this land, so for me, that's not my fight right now. But I am an ally standing next to other Native Americans from the area who are fighting to keep their lands, honor treaty rights, not have environmental pollution in the water streams, and those kinds of things. So there are many other things that nations fight for. And the nations are a government relationship. You know, the government made treaties nation to nation. They still do. They don't do it nation to individual or nation to corporation. And so when you do your treaties nation to nation, it makes it seem like the U.S., it has to be towards the U.S., but that's not actually in practice how it is. People who are from tribal communities and nations can also have agreements among themselves. So, you know, if we're going to come over here and go to your pipeline protests, and then, you know, next week we're going to do one here for this waterway, and we'll make an agreement that we're going to show up for each other. So we can also do it between our nations. We as a broad term.
Okay, so the next question is, for so long learning about Native and Indigenous people in Massachusetts meant taking a field trip to what was then Plymouth Plantation in elementary school, and learning about the whitewashed version of what was called the First Thanksgiving. Later, we were told the story of Christopher Columbus discovering America. While that's starting to change in classroom, what can parents do to ensure their children are receiving an accurate education about the history and culture of Native and Indigenous people, specifically in our area?
Well, if we're specifically looking in this area, we really want to debunk the Thanksgiving story. If we're looking at the so-called origin of the country, then we're looking more at the Columbus story, which is my nation's story. But both of them are known across the country and are problematic because national holidays are attached to them. So even if you say, I don't teach that, it's like, well, you did get the day off. So did you tell kids why they had the day off? Right? So it's still connected to a bigger institution than just the grade level that you're at. What parents can do is educate yourself, however it is that you're going to educate yourself, and then you can augment your conversations with your children. If you want to go the level of supporting some of the bills that are in the State House currently, including improving this education, by all means, write letters, call, even go and testify, although they do not make that easy. Testifying at the State House is like an all-day affair, and you're waiting and waiting and waiting to get called, and there's a lot of interruptions, and it is worth doing, but it is not easy, right? So, doing this work is not easy work. It's hard work. And there's often emotions attached to it. So like guilt that you didn't learn it, anger that you're learning it now or about what you're learning, sadness. I mean, there's a lot of emotions, and we just need to be ready for that. Yeah. And I think this is the kind of education, age and grade stage appropriate, needs to be taught at all levels, because kids of color, including Native American kids, are coming into school already knowing this history. Jewish kids come in and know history that is not happy history in all cases. And so why not give language and words and accurate information right off? And then as kids progress through school, you can add in the other details and complications of it. And so we need to do a better job as educators and as parents educating ourselves. I educated my own children. I have 5 children. I educated them and all of their friends that came to my dinner table, or all of their friends that we went out to eat. It may have been, hey, we're having corn, that's indigenous. It might have been simple as that, or it might have been, no, we're not shopping there, or we're not eating there, and this is why we're not going there, because, they use some product, or I don't want to diss everything here on live TV. But I might make choices of places that I boycott based on who they're supporting or and what they're involved in. And so anybody who was with me in hearing distance would hear that same story. So we have some power, and money talks. So where we spend our money is a really important piece too. Are we spending it on books by indigenous authors? Are we spending it on food that is supporting pipelines, or that is being environmental friendly? So there are choices that we can make that money is attached to. And if we can't offer money as a donation to some place, then maybe we can offer time, or maybe we can offer a moment every day where we talk about the injustices or the education or history or contributions of indigenous people. So there are other ways that we can speak up that doesn't have to have money attached to it.
The next question is, what does feminism and women's empowerment mean to you? How does your identity as an indigenous woman influence that definition?
So I see feminism as something that all genders can be a part of. So we can all be feminists, which means equal rights for women, as I understand it from the people who I've read. And equal rights for women is something that all of us, whether we're male, female, gender fluid, gender neutral, however we identify, we can be feminists. I think as identifying as an indigenous woman has made it that I have borne the brunt of any stereotypes or oppression as well, in a way that maybe someone who doesn't identify as female hasn't had. So assumptions that I am not as smart or prepared for a certain kind of job, those kinds of things. I feel as a woman, and I also feel that from my indigenous piece that women have a lot of power and energy, right? Women are the creators, and we can give life and we can create in other ways. So some women create through their art. Some women create by being the aunties and creating family and community. So that cultural tradition and belief of women being empowered and creative and the future and the educators is also really strong for me, not just the dominant culture's view of feminism.
So this question is from Dr. Charles Desmond. He said, given the long trail of loss that indigenous Americans have experienced, can you share your views on how to strengthen and resiliency of Native women have enabled Native people to overcome the barriers and obstacles that have been faced to thrive in their homeland?
That's a long question.
Yeah.
I want to refer back to the books only because I did bring female authors today, and people like Winona LaDuke talk about what they've been doing. And so, leading the food sovereignty movement, for example, is things that individual women have done. And there's women all through history that have led their nations in different ways. I mean, even in my nation, Anna Kawana is a female leader who helped fight against Columbus and his men. So there have always been women. There will always be women.
Yeah.
So we move forward. People who identify as female will lead in those ways. You're going to have to remind me what the other parts of that question was.
It's kind of long.
Just the beginning part?
Okay. He said, given the long trail of loss that Indigenous Americans have experienced, can you share your views on, how to strengthen and resiliency of Native women?
Okay, so I got another connection here.
Okay.
All right. Thank you for prompting that again. There has been a long line of loss, not just from land, not just from people, not just from the population being decimated, but children were taken. The boarding school industrial boarding school situation, where children were removed and traveled thousands of miles away from their nations, continued in the United States until 1978, in Canada until 1996. I was still in school. I mean, this is current time. The Native people didn't even have religious freedom till 1978, which is probably one reason there weren't so many powwows when I was growing up, because that could also be considered spiritual and religious by people who don't know. But because children were taken, the cultural connection stopped, and some of them were then adopted into other families, and so they don't even know they have Native heritage. There's probably more Indigenous children, but they didn't grow up that way. And a lot of them were killed and died. So there's a thing about the children being taken from Indigenous communities that's really important to understand. And like other kinds of laws that are created, there's backlash, and they sort of morph into other things. And so in 1978, it was no longer allowed to take children and put them in these boarding schools. But that didn't stop children from being taken from Indigenous families. They were just taken in different ways. So women were forced to be, Native women were forced to be sterilized. Families had children taken and put in the foster care because they were seen as not adequately prepared, or for other reasons, to take care of their own children. And so other systems came in place, and that kind of process of taking children away, it continues to this day, right up to Arizona COVID time, where there were women giving birth in the hospital who couldn't see their children because their zip codes were seen as being on the reservation. You could look it up. And those children weren't immediately given back to the parents for the stereotype fear of they can't really raise their children kind of thing. So the law known as the Indian Child Welfare Act, ICWA, is being challenged in the Supreme Court right now, and we need to make sure that it stays in place. It is being challenged as a race-biased law. So I feel like it's important to say a little about that right now. It's being challenged that equal protection under the law means that everybody racially gets the same rights. And so if you say that Indian children can only be raised, the first right of refusal should be the Indian tribe, like the community. The Indian tribe gets to decide whether that child goes to a white, let's say, white family or not, then that's race-based and that's not legal. The problem is this isn't a race issue. I mean, it is a race issue just like it's always race issues, but it isn't a race issue because it's also about tribal sovereignty. So you're actually talking about the tribe's sovereign right, or the nation, or we could substitute country if that helps you understand it, right? It's the country's right to raise their own children and not have white Americans take them out, right? So when you think of it like that, it's not really race-based, it's nation-based, it's country-based, it's tribal sovereignty that we're looking at. And so we need to remember that sometimes it's about race, but sometimes it's not really about race. They're using race to say that we're going to break down that law because it's race-based, but that's not the only thing that law is. And it protects Indigenous people to be able to raise their own children.
The next one is, what are your thoughts on reparations for aggrieved Native Americans?
Did you say reparations?
Yes.
I'm still thinking about what reparations means is I think about it a lot in the descendants of people who were stolen from their lands and um, forced to give unpaid labor to this country in its creation. And that gets brought up a lot with reparations. But what is that reparations going to be? Land? Because then you got the problem with the land was taken from indigenous people. So how can you give land that was originally stolen as well? And so I think that our destinies of people who were taken from their land and people who had their land taken from them are intertwined in the future, not to mention that we are intermarried, where we have descendants that are combined as well. So I think it's a complicated question to think about it. I think a good place to start is looking closer at the treaties and seeing what the treaties say. So the taking of Alcatraz in the 70s was part of a treaty law that said unused federal land reverts back to indigenous people. And that Alcatraz Island was unused federal land, so they were making a statement about that particular part of the law. But we could start to return national parks. I'm not a fan, but it is the right thing. Like, it's fair. I mean, I haven't visited all the national parks, and I understand that there's emotions involved in this. And if it was land that was taken and that's land we could give back, that's part of the reparations. Part of the reparations is honoring those original treaties. And here's the thing, can anyone name a treaty in the United States? Any treaty? Anyone? I mean, this is part of the piece of we're not really learning the history of this country. We're not even learning the history of this country past 1700. We learn a lot of 1620 on, but we're not even learning that history accurately, right? Because we can't name a treaty. So look up the 1963 Treaty of Fort Laramie, because it's a really important treaty, and if you're going to learn one, why not learn that one? It's related to the Black Hills, and it's related to the Sioux and the Gold Rush and a lot of the other kinds of things we learned, but has its own story. And so, we need to learn the treaties, or at least a couple of them as placeholders.
Yeah. So the last question is, what is the biggest misconception about Native American people?
Finally, an easy one. The biggest misconception is that we're all dead. I meet people and we have a little conversation. I introduce myself and they say, I'm, let's say Irish because of today. I'm Irish. Where are you, or where are you from? What's your background? And I'll say, oh, I'm Native American. I'm Arawak, and I'll say I'm Native American, and they'll say, oh, really? What tribe or nation? If they say nation, I'll be like, oh, they're with it. They're getting it. So what nation are you from? And I'll say I'm Arawak, and they'll say, aren't they all dead? Which, I just said I was, so you were challenging that I just said that, and it is the number one problem that we're only seen historically and so believed to be dead or disappeared. And all the things I've read verify that, so I'm not making that up just for my personal story. And so the idea that we are invisible, but we are also hyper-visible, but we are only hyper-visible on the entire continuum of who we are. There's Thanksgiving, Columbus, Thanksgiving, sports teams, and maybe a couple of other things. And nothing else is told about our story. So there's hypervisibility in these 5 points and invisibility of everything else. And so when you start talking about indigenous people, start talking about present tense, first of all, because we're still alive.
Let me see if I can get on camera here.
Yeah.
Wow. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jewo. Thank you. And thank you, Claudia, for agreeing to do this for us today. Sally Karen, our state rep, was going to be here, but unfortunately she couldn't make it. So she did drop off a citation for you.
Oh.
As a token of appreciation for all the work that you do. By the way, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Joko. I'm the chairman of the Human Rights and Inclusion Committee here in town. And I'll just read it. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the House of Representatives citation. Be it hereby known to all that the Massachusetts House of Representatives offers its sincere congratulations to Claudia Fox-Tree in recognition of your scholarship, activism, and tireless work to give voice to the experience of Indigenous and Native American people. The entire membership extends its very best wishes and expresses the hope for future good fortunes and continued success. I left my glasses. In all endeavors. Thank you.
That's lovely.
And given on the 17th of March, 2022, at the State House, Boston, Massachusetts, and that was signed by the Speaker of the House, Ronald Mariano, and offered by our State Representative, Sally P. Cairns. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. How wonderful. It looks so fancy. All right, I feel like I should stand for this or something. I don't want to trip over any of the cords here. I'm going to stand? Can I do that? Yeah. Let's do it. Let's do it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and this concludes our program for tonight. Thank you.